Strangers in Space podcast. And for the next 45 minutes exactly, we're going to be talking about Jethro Tull, so you don't have to.
Hello, I'm Lee.
Hi, I'm Matt. Hello.
Hello.
Lee and I are the only people who like Jethro Tull.
In the world.
And my slight problem with Music Club is I'm very, very picky over the bands I talk about and listen to. So there is no way I'm going to be listening to anything that I don't want to listen to or I'm not interested in.
Wow.
So Lee and I have convened to talk about Jethro Tull for 45 minutes because JR and Simon wouldn't want to, and we know that, and we wouldn't want to force them to. So Jethro Tull. So I guess we start briefly by sort of saying what our relationship is with Jethro Tull, which sounds like a creepy police interview. Where did Jethro Tull touch you on your body?
I think because we've only got 45 minutes, what we don't want to be doing is reviewing every album, etc. We can't do that. We also don't want to be trying to talk about it in a way that is introducing Jethro Tull to people. We're hoping you've heard of them. And if you haven't, you might want to go and look on Wikipedia or listen to a few albums and then come back. Because I want to assume that people know who Jethro Tull are and at least know a couple of albums or songs. So we don't have to kind of like break it all down. So 45
and
minutes
if you're not entirely familiar with them, they can be broken down into kind of rough genres. Their musical style changes. And so I think we're going to highlight one or two songs that are indicative of each genre that you might go and listen to, say, on YouTube, where they all are, and then you can kind of get an idea for the flavour of them.
Yes, because
so how did you encounter them, Lee?
Well, my brother used to play them quite a lot when I was growing up. He discovered them. I probably expect my family had played them at some point. I don't know how he came across them, but Songs from the Wood was my first album, I think, really. Aqualung probably there as well. Crest of a Knave, because I got into them in the mid-'80s. So those were my kind of 3A as well, actually. So I had a real feeling of the different types of genres which they were messing around with at the time, which kind of blew my mind a bit, really, because it was so creative. And I'm massively into things like Mike Oldfield's early stuff as well, and modern stuff. But there's so much going on. I get bored very quickly with music, and I think the more that's going on, the more interesting stuff that's going on, the more fun I have, which is why prog rock probably interests me as well. So yeah, I picked up on it from my brother's bedroom when he used to be painting his Warhammer, when it was originally the original Warhammer, not the Warhammer now. And Napoleonic kind of like wargaming figures, and all I could smell this humble paint and Jethro Tull coming from the room, and it just feels like by osmosis. First album must have been Crest of a Knave for me that I actually bought, but after that, I bought everything that I could possibly grab about them.
And I got into them in college, so in 93, 94, and my mate Will got me into it. I think we both saw around the 90s there was a repeat of Top of the Pops, one of their rare Top of the Pops performances of Witch's Promise.
Yeah.
Which is an insane performance. If anybody should look it up on YouTube. It's a really sort of charismatic, mental, ridiculous performance. Delete as applicable. And I think we watched that at the same time, and I think he bought the Best Of album and then shared it with me. So we got into it by listening to the full range up to that point of Jethro Tull albums, and then we could actually identify the ones that we liked, and then we could target those albums. And gradually, my experience of Jethro Tull expanded from those albums we picked out, because then we tried the albums around those albums, and then we gradually built it up and up and up. And I think I've been into different Jethro Tull albums periodically. They've sort of, each one has sort of grown on me at different times. But I think for me it's the sort of mid-'70s, the Songs from the Wood, Minstrel in the Gallery, and Heavy Horses. That's the stuff that we were really into when I was at college. And then it's just expanded from then. And then Roots to Branches came out just as we got into Jethro Tull. So we sort of bought that and kind of not forced ourselves into it, but kind of tried to get into that and tried to appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean the thing, the change, the big flux, the big change in the sound of Jethro Tull, because in the 70s it was, I will say, orchestrated. There was no orchestra necessarily, but they are an orchestrated band, aren't they? There's a load of people in the band. They're big sounding. It's creative. It's a big sound. It's analog sound as well. Don't forget. And then when we hit the 80s, it was still kind of quite strong. It hadn't quite lost that impact. But I think when you get into the 90s, especially the end of the 90s, that period of Jethro Tull from then till now, there is I always felt like there was something missing until this new album, actually, which feels a bit more fuller. I felt like it was a little bit skinny around the sides, especially when they played the songs live. You just didn't have that full breadth of the band because everything was done on like a keyboard. So I think when you talk about those 10 years, because they were the golden years really from 70 to 80 for a lot of people for Jethro Tull, that is the period that people will remember Jethro Tull standing on one leg doing his act in his leather coat and all that sort of thing. And it's not, by the way, Jethro Tull isn't the singer, it's Ian Anderson. Jethro Tull's the name of the band. And then they got massive. They got massive in America, didn't they? And Bursting Out, the double album came out, which is a phenomenal live album to listen to. And then they kind of dissipated a bit in the early 80s when music really changed. And electronic music came in, and they were doing what they wanted to do, but people didn't seem to like what they want to do and what the changes were. Then they came back in the mid 80s with was it a Grammy that they won? Something like that.
They somehow accidentally won a Grammy, and there was an outcry about it.
Yeah,
because they won.
Yeah, because I also loved best rock album.
Yeah.
Yes, because
they beat something like AC/DC or
no, it was Metallica.
Okay, Metallica.
And I love Metallica, so it was really funny because both bands at the time I was really into, and one was like squaring up to the other. well, Ian Anderson was just kind of going, "That's ridiculous. How do we win that?" But anyway, they had another resurgence. But since that, they've waned in popularity, and it's just hardcore fans, I think, that really love what they do. And we mustn't forget, like you say, all the albums around the Jethro Tull album. So there's 22 albums of Jethro Tull music, plus there are a lot of Ian Anderson albums, probably about 10 now, I think. And they, at least 6 or 7 of those, I would say, are definitely worth listening to properly. And the other ones are okay, But such a lot of music.
The output of fresh material has slowed dramatically since since 1990, really, since the beginning of the 1990s. But they've done very well at kind of feeding this kind of nostalgia machine by re-releasing old albums, remastering old albums, sort of 20th anniversaries, 40th anniversaries of the old albums, adding extra tracks, and also touring as well. So he's just endlessly toured whilst his voice can manage it. Constantly going around the world.
He had a voice problem back in the early 80s, and I think Under Wraps killed it off. The album Under Wraps, it was quite challenging for him, so he did a tour, and I think that knackered it. But the problem is he never really sung properly. He never learnt properly. He was all self-taught, and he never went for singing lessons, apparently. So therefore, he was ripping his throat to shreds, and he's never been the same since. So he's had to always keep up with the past while singing live, which puts even more pressure on his voice. So when you start hearing his output in the 90s or whatever, it is sometimes quite hard to enjoy, because as a fan that he's straining to get some notes in there, But that's possibly why the output was a little bit less as well, perhaps.
Yeah, and also he's become fabulously wealthy because he became an independent salmon farmer. I think he became he kept fisheries in Scotland, and he became a millionaire or multi-millionaire because of his fishing activities, his salmon farming activities, rather than his music.
Yeah, so he became given up since.
Yeah, but he became independently wealthy, basically, which is an extraordinary thing to do. I think so. So we wind back the clock. Like the ticker thing.
But before you do that, just for a very quick note on all of the reissues. So for anybody who wanted to go online and start listening to Jethro Tull, I would recommend actually just listening to the newer stuff. I know that the mixes are different. I know that 1 or 2 of the albums some people didn't like the mix of, but it doesn't matter. If you're new to Jethro Tull, go ahead and have a listen, because Ian Anderson's been involved in these albums, and Steve Wilson, isn't it, of that great band Porcupine Tree, who did all the remixes, and they are phenomenally good. I mean, they are absolutely fantastic, and the box sets are ridiculous, but you can get them all on streaming services now. So go and have a listen to maybe some of the ones we're recommending, and listen to the updated versions.
Absolutely. So let's wind back to the beginning, and bearing in mind we've got 45 minutes to cover these periods. So they start as a blues band playing in the sort of late 60s, around the same time as the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin. They're
a white man's blues band, and he was very aware of this and felt uncomfortable continuing to do it. When I say he, I always refer to Ian as he. So, he started with an harmonica and all this sort of thing. Then he picked up the flute, which he only ever played in blues scales and things like that. And he plays wrong anyway. He's been playing it wrong for years, officially. So he just wanted to be the loudest, kind of most interesting and diverse kind of player out there to really get the interest up. And the album is really interesting because it was titled that way, because that is how he literally saw the band. They're not going to be going back and doing blues anymore. That's it. That was Jethro Tull, that album. So the album he released, which is his first album, was the album basically shouting out doom to the band of the time, and they moved on to some other area.
Yeah, I think they increased in sophistication certainly through the first 4 albums. It's a similar sort of approach, this kind of blues approach, but they increase each time for me in sophistication. So there's 4 albums. This was Stand Up, Benefit, and Aqualung. And for me, this was Stand Up. I don't know that much. They've always been a bit like the Beatles' first few albums. I never had any interest in going that far back, because Benefit sounded raw, and it sounded kind of still like an unformed version of Aqualung, but it still hooked me. And I sort of unconsciously felt that was about as far back as I wanted to go.
Now, I think Stand Up came out before Benefit, didn't it? But Benefit oddly sounds like it could have been the second album. For me, it's the sound of it and the whole mix of it and the feeling of it feels like, for anybody who's an Iron Maiden fan, Killers is like the second album that they did, which doesn't really bear the fruits of stronger tunes for me, although incredibly atmospheric and quite dour. Actually, it's quite a dour album, whereas Stand Up I think is quite upbeat, and it's quite there's a lot of beautiful sounding acoustic guitar songs on there and things like that, whereas Benefit feels quite 60s, quite psychedelic in places, and I get a bit lost in it, and I know so many people love it, but it's not really one of my favorites. But Aqualung, go on.
It might be why it appeals to me, because at the same time I was getting into this is when I was listening to Benefit, I was listening to the Kinks and to sort of Rubber Soul Revolver, that mid-range Beatles stuff,
and that fits really well in that kind of era.
Yeah, but Aqualung I think for me is the first big kind of distinctive Jethro Tull album.
This is an amazing album, isn't it? From the gatefold sleeve and the painting on the front, which is just beautiful in itself. And I don't. How can you describe this album in 40? You can't even do it you can't do it in 45 minutes, let alone 2 minutes.
It's an album that looks like a concept album. It looks like it's being created with some sort of unified vision, but it's not. It's kind of accidental. It's retrospectively applied. It's quite filthy. So one of the things I love about Ian Anderson is his lyrics are really parochial, really kind of earthy, kind of really witty at times, quite carry on at times, completely unlike, they aren't pompous, but they have mock pomposity in them. Sometimes he goes Latin, or he brings medieval stuff in, but it's always with a kind of a slightly sort of satirical sneer to it. And Aqualung, the opening title, the title track to Aqualung is about a sleazy tramp who's sat at these schoolyard gates watching school kids, and it's horrible. It's really
that's a couple
really
of lines
itchy to listen to.
There's a couple of lines in the song about that, but it's essentially, it was written about a homeless man that him and his wife of the time, I think, observed, and they kind of wrote it together, I believe. And it was kind, it's not necessarily cheering on perverts and all this sort of thing. And even though he takes that persona and plays around with it in a very kind of madcap, late night cinema, peeping Tom type thing of the 70s, isn't it all right? Yeah, carry on, Dick, and all that stuff. But actually, there's a serious element to all the stuff he does on this album, and it all has a different meaning. So he's writing stories. He looks around, and most of this album is about writing stories about either people or his thoughts on, religious, organized religion, which we'll get to in a minute. But you're right in saying that a lot of people assume, it is assumed that this is a concept album by quite a few people. It isn't. It's just like you say, 3 or 4 songs are connected. So there are 3 or 4 religious songs. There are 3 or 4 songs about the low life of London that he's picked up on, or whatever. Cross-Eyed Mary is another good example. Songs that you could never write now because they'd be misinterpreted utterly.
Yeah. And for my money, there are also kind of really sweet songs in this. So Cheap Day Return and Wandering Aloud. Cheap Day Return is about him catching a train to see his dad in hospital, and Wandering Aloud is a rare love song. And they for me are the real. They've got this sort of lightness that kind of, because it's actually quite a dark album. It's quite a heavy album, particularly the second side, which, as you said, a lot about organized religion and him growing up in a church school. But you've got these 2 kind of quite light, distinctive songs that are really short, but they kind of, I'm going to say something pretentious now, cleanse your palate between the darker songs, and I really love.
They do, and that echoes quite a few of his little singles and B-sides and all that he was releasing at the time. I think Wandering Aloud had a few different versions of in the end as well. And that you get to hear. I mean, you hear his guitar on stand-up, his acoustic guitar, but this is where you get to hear him playing the guitar as he will always play it from now on. The acoustic guitar, all that kind of widdly stuff. If you're a guitar player, which I know you are, and I am,
really difficult to play.
It's really hard to play.
Well, I mean, Wandering Aloud. I spent a year trying to get the twiddly bits, and I never managed it. Will managed it, but just. And I think it's that. Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, this is what I love about the band, and this is what people should be doing now, which they're not. Everybody's following a pattern. Everybody's buying a package on how to learn the guitar. Everybody's following the Ed Sheeran brand or whatever. You need to go out there, make mistakes, make it your own, and ignore the fact that there's any guitar player that's following the rules, and that's how it should be. No, you're like an artist. You learn the trade, and then you mess around with it, or you learn the basics, and then just make it your own. And with Ian Anderson, you can hear even the flute playing, it's all DIY. Everything he did was, he didn't really know what he was doing. He was just picking up and going, right, I'm going to go for this, I'm going to do this. And that is his style, and it's different. It's different to anybody else's style that I've ever heard of, actually.
And I think Aqualung was mistaken as a concept album, but sort of works as it does work as a concept album. But then they really go into concept albums, because then you've got Thick as a Brick, Passion Play, arguably War Child as well, I think. And I think I'd group Minstrel in the Gallery. I think Minstrel in the Gallery is a kind of a transitional piece between these kind of big kind of albums that link everything together, and then the folky phase. What do you think of Thick as a Brick first? What do you think?
This is also termed the progressive rock phase as well. So 3 or 4 albums in a row, progressive rock, which it is. But it is. It's absolutely 100% a concept album. They did it on purpose because so many people were saying, "Oh, Aqualung was a concept album." They go, "No, it's not. We wouldn't do that. It's really pompous." They hated that sort of thing. So in there, they thought, "Do you know what? We'll just go ahead and do one anyway for a bit of a laugh." And it just so happens to be one of the best concept albums ever made, really. With an absolutely cracking A side, which you can play over and over again, and which he's done in its entirety live many times. B-side is just a bit repetitive of the first side, if you ask me, but that A-side is quite incredible, really. What do you think of the album?
I think I wouldn't recommend people start with it, because I think actually it is intimidating, even though it is one continuous. So it's two sort of 20-25 minute parts.
Songs, yeah.
And I think that can be intimidating, but it is broken down into recognizable tunes, but with sort of repeated motifs linking them. So there is a way through, but I think it is it's not as catchy as the other ones. It took me longer to get into it. I think Passion Play I actually like slightly more than Thick as a Brick, but that took me even longer to get into it. And again, my entry to that was the anniversary album where they clipped out a sort of a 3-minute section of Passion Play, which is amazing. It sounds like nothing else at that stage I'd ever heard before. It had Latin in it and it had sort of strange sounds. But Passion Play also famously has a spoken word story at the end of the first half, I think.
And a video to it. Have you seen the video? It's bonkers.
Yeah, and the video, which is the story of the hare who lost his spectacles. Which isn't catchy.
No.
But it is quite genuinely quite funny.
It's quite cute, and it's Alice in Wonderland meets Monty Python, really, isn't it? And that's they were really riding on the Monty Python comedy tails at that point. I think they just started to really get into their personalities on stage. John Evans looked like an ice cream seller. One of the bass player, I've forgotten his name now, was wearing the zebra striped outfit from top to bottom. They were going for it. So even when you look at pictures now, if people look at pictures in the past of the band, they'll be going, "Oh, what a bunch of pompous idiots." They were really just having a laugh, and that's the whole point of this band. Now with Passion Play, they took it seriously. This is when they went, "Oh, the concept album sold well. Everybody likes it. Let's do this properly." So they went and did it properly, and then the critics raised it to the ground.
Yeah,
which Ian Anderson was very upset about.
But probably rightly so as well. Yeah. I think. I mean,
well, it's because he said, "Come along to a theatre. I'll put it on. We'll have screens and dancers and all that sort of thing." And instead of kind of breaking them in gently, he just put all the critics in one room and played the entire album on stage. And if you've never heard it before, it's quite a hard one to get into. Do you know, I must have heard it maybe 25 times in my entire life, which probably isn't a lot for a Jethro Tull album for me. And I still can't remember parts of it or how it would go from start to end, whereas I can remember every other album. And it's the only one that really foxes me sometimes. But I'm glad it foxes me. I like to be tested.
And speaking of, the critics didn't like it, which led them to abandon the country, move to France as a sort of tax exile exercise. And they tried to record their next album there, and it didn't quite work out. And actually, those outtakes end up sort of scattered over the next few albums as sort of fleshed out songs, and on an album called Nightcap, which I think is a great sort of rare unreleased songs, which is difficult to get hold of, but it's got loads of good songs, all of which you can now get on various re-releases of the albums. But they made War Child eventually out of this kind of scarring session. And this is kind of a War Child's an odd album because it's not really concept, but they haven't quite gone into their kind of pastoral folky phase yet.
No, well,
but it's got a few catchy stuff in it.
Interestingly, I think it would have been a concept album because it was supposed to be based. They were making a film. He was creating a film about, I think, heaven and earth and going to heaven or whatever. But you can see all of these elements on the album cover on the back, and you can see the feeling of a lot of the tunes are very, very similar. And in fact, when you buy the extras now, you get the entire, I think it was like a ballet piece and all kinds of, you get all the instrumentation, the orchestration of the film score, which didn't ever happen. And you can kind of see what he was aiming for. And it would have been a really interesting project to have finished. It would have had elements of the meaning of life in it, I think, like Monty Python. It would have had that kind of feeling, sure. But I love this album, and I love it because it's just got so many good, strong songs on it. Bungle in the Jungle is on there, Skating Away on a Thin Ice of a Day. They're all classics now. But the one about the angels is just you sit there and you listen to it, and it's beautifully recorded. The songs are strong. They're riding on a high with their songwriting here, and I think it's quite underrated, an album. But no, that's one of my favourites.
Only Solitaire, again, I really like these kind of short, twiddly, kind of throwaway songs. But Only Solitaire is the one where he sort of talks about the critics, and it's just a really pretty song. I think
it's a pretty song with quite a dark undertone.
yeah. I'm gonna skip Minstrel in the gallery for a second. Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die is one of the two albums I don't really know.
Okay, this is an album that I don't know massive amounts about either. I know that when you bought the gatefold sleeve, you would have like this cartoon strip in it. It is a story, so actually it's another concept album in a way, but then again it's really loosely linked. They're not completely linked together. There's some really good strong tracks on here, but when I listened to the original Tour de Rock and Roll Too Young Down, I mean not the re-release of the new mixes, right? It was always in my bottom 4 albums of the group. It didn't ever really jump out at me. The one about the quiz master, quiz time, whatever it's called, Quiz Kid at the beginning is a good one. Taxi Grab, Salamander, a couple of other ones are quite good. But when I heard the re-release, I felt like I was listening to a brand new album, because the re-release was, and get this, they went onto TV to record the entire album as an album video. But in order to do that, there's some legal thing where they had to re-record it for TV. So there's a second album. And I think that second album is better. And the remix of it is just like listening to a brand new album for me. So I would always recommend, if you can listen to Old Rock and Roll Too Young to Die, get the remix version of the TV soundtrack version of the album, which is much better.
I think what put me off it was the song on the anniversary album, Never Too Old to Rock and Roll, which was fine, but it wasn't my style. And the album cover as well put me off. But it's a weird position, because for me, there are 3 albums that I equate as being, I almost equate it like the folk horror trilogy that I love, the kind of Wicker Man, Blood and Satan's Claw, Witchfinder General. I think Minstrel in the Gallery, Songs from the Wood, Heavy Horses are the 3 albums that for me are the best of Jethro Tull. They're the albums I go back to time and again. They're the albums that actually mean so much to me from my childhood. They're the albums I got into first, and they're the albums that kind of take me back there.
So tell me about Minstrel in the Gallery. Before you do, it was, I think, realised at the time that Ian Anderson wanted to go off and do a solo album, and then it became a band album. So there's most of this is him playing on his own, I think. So anyway, but with that in mind, what is it about Minstrel in the Gallery that sticks with you?
I mean, Minstrel in the Gallery is odd, because I always group it with Heavy Horses and Songs from the Wood, but actually it's nothing. It's the only thing that links it is this kind of, it's got this kind of medieval aesthetic to it, and I think a lot of that is purely from the song Minstrel in the Gallery, and from the album cover. So actually thinking about it completely abstractly, not comparing it to other albums or later albums, I think it's probably a continuation of Aqualung, really. Most of the second side is Baker Street Muse, which is a 16-minute song, but it is fantastic. It's sort of made up of these little vignettes. Again, filthy, really dirty, highly observational, but that would fit in quite well with Aqualung.
I still don't actually know what that's about, and I don't want to, in a way.
No, I mean, it is almost like a psychedelic form of him wandering around London, and just, I mean, there are dwarves in it, there are brothels, there are, I mean, there's loads.
I don't know if you know the band Tiger Lilies, but it's a bit like an early Tiger Lilies song, and they're very, very to the bone. But yeah, he has got this rawness to him, and this is what I love about him. And we'll talk about it a bit later, where he crossbreeds. In fact, Songs from the Wood, he crossbreeds a modern day aesthetic or things that are intruding upon the countryside and the eerie countryside as well, the folk horror of the countryside, and the mystery and the legends, and it combats against each other. But he's always really been like that with his music. And Aqualung is the same. There are fairy tales in that, Mother Goose and all this. So he brings that fairy tale element in, and then kind of crashes through his metaphors, with the modern day moans, really, and observations.
He's always been very British. He's never kind of Americanized. He's always been, and I think he's always been a nostalgist as well. So whether that's for good or for bad, he's always looked back on his childhood and on his past and drawn from it, always drawn from what's around him. He's not really a sort of fantasy. I mean, he kind of weaves in fantasy into these elements. I think Minstrel in the Gallery, actually, there are really just 2 parts that I really love, which is Baker Street Muse and Minstrel in the Gallery, the song. But Minstrel in the Gallery, the song, is 8 minutes long. Baker Street Muse is 16 minutes long. That's most of it. That's a big old chunk of the album.
But
The
they're
rest is
epic.
good.
They are epic, aren't they? And if you were to take a 1 minute of any Jethro Tull song from that era, there are more ideas in that than an entire album of anybody releasing acoustic music today. And I don't mean that to be I don't want to be derogatory about artists creating music today. It's a different form. It's different. What people like is different now. But I just appreciate the fact there's so much creativity in a minute of Jethro Tull music. He obviously hasn't got ADHD, but he's got that kind of attention deficit music thing, a bit like me, where I get bored really quickly, so he has to change it, and and it catches you off guard, but it doesn't catch you off guard so much that you feel like it's a jab in the side. It's unnoticeable, the links between all these different parts of music, and it can stop and become something entirely different, and it still fits. That just takes a lot of talent, actually.
And then there are kind of 3 albums really, which are kind of pastoral albums. The third of which, Stormwatch, is starting to move into the electronic phase.
A little bit, yeah.
But I mean, we've talked a lot about Songs from the Wood because we recorded a podcast about it that never got beyond the computer, I don't think.
Yeah.
But actually, for me, I think Heavy Horses. I mean, Songs from the Wood is great, and Songs from the Wood kind of encapsulates this. Ian Anderson moves to the countryside from London or wherever. He starts farming. He becomes a sort of a gentleman of the estate, and he kind of still writes songs of things around him, but now around him are woods and kind of churches and carvings and fires, and he brings all of that together, and he's obviously got an awareness of folklore and British history. But I think Heavy Horses is Heavy Horses trumps it because it's got more of that kind of, it's almost like Ian Anderson's been living in the countryside for a bit longer now, and he knows the reality of what the countryside is, which is, it's a business and there's an industry involved to it.
Yeah, there's a softer panning out of the music in Heavy Horses, whereas Songs from the Wood is frenetic, it's upbeat, and I think this is why I like it. Every single track, apart from Ring Out Solstice Bells, which feels like it doesn't seem to fit on the album quite as well as the others, but every single song is the most perfectly created piece of music in my book. There isn't anything wrong with any of it, and the mixes are incredible. The band is utterly together in creatively there. His voice is phenomenal. The melodies and the lyrics and the aesthetic, that the actual painting, I think it's a painting on the front cover. No, the whole package is the package word, isn't it? The whole package of Jethro Tull is, if I was to recommend an album to anybody, it would be Songs from the Wood, and it's the one I've bought for people over and over again to say, look, have a listen to this, see what you think. A drummer, I bought it for a drummer. I said, listen to the drums on this, because Barrymore Barlow plays drums, all different types of drums on that. You get organs, and they're trying so many different instruments out, and even though it's you can look at it and it's of its time, a lot of the stuff is sexist now, things like Hunting Girl and things like that.
Yeah.
But you've got to enjoy it for what it is, which is to me a creative pastoral masterpiece. Heavy Horses are great, but I feel like it's just missing those quirky elements that I really enjoy in Songs from the Wood.
And I think for me, I really like the lighter songs, the songs like Moths and Weathercock really kind of lift it, and Journeyman as well has this kind of distinctive kind of rhythm to it.
They're all lovely.
But it's a cigarette card separating the 2 albums. I mean, Jack and the Green, I think, is the best Jethro Tull song. It's short and it's punchy. He plays all the instruments on it. It is an Ian Anderson solo.
It's incredible,
song.
And that's the song that I was referring to when I meant about the modern day crashing in with the fairy tale world and legends of old England. So yeah,
I think so. I'm going to accelerate now because we really want to review the latest album.
Yeah.
But it becomes a bit electronic now, and the electronic stuff I kind of it's growing on me. Stormwatch. I really like Stormwatch, and actually things like By Dunring Hill is an amazing album, and the the video for it is very, very similar to the Bowie's Ashes to Ashes, and I've never quite known which comes first.
That came first.
Really? So it predates Ashes to Ashes.
Yeah.
I mean, Ashes to Ashes borrows from Jethro Tull in that case.
Yeah, probably.
Just say,
like nearly every other band in the world.
But again, also on Stormwatch's Home, there's a really sort of elegiac song called Home, which isn't electronic. It's
a ballad. It's his first proper ballad.
Yeah.
I think. And he's orchestra on it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Who's the orchestrating person on? He became a member of the band.
David. He changed his name from David to D at some point. D Palmer.
D Palmer. That's right. Yes. Or David Palmer at the time. Yeah. So that's right. Yeah. So David Palmer did all the scores on anything you hear through the 60s and 70s. That was Palmer doing all the orchestration, and that's where that band is lucky as well, because it's not just a band, and that's probably what I'm missing in the modern I was going to say Doctor Who then. The modern Jethro Tull is that the orchestration we don't have anymore. We don't have that backing, that sound, and on Home, it's staggeringly beautiful. It makes you cry. Actually, it's one of those things where it makes grown men cry. Yeah. But
I think the album A was traditionally the one that Will and I decided was the worst Jethro Tull album ever, but actually listening to it, I slowly get into one or two songs every time I listen to it, and I think Fylingdale Flyer on that one, which is about the kind of the US building air bases in the UK and the sort of fear of nuclear war. So it's a very sort of 80s centre to it.
And that's a story. That's a story about where they thought they saw some UFOs or something turned up on the radar, and it was just a flock of seagulls or something, wasn't it? So that's what that song's about, and I love that whole. I'm surprised you're not more into it, because it's so sci-fi. It's like the I'm trying to think of anything early 80s that was science fiction based, basically, is in that album, in those videos, and it is bonkers. It's a strange album, and they've got Eddie Jobson on there, I think, doing a bit of violin and keyboard stuff. And he does push it. And Black Sunday, I think, is one of my top 10 favorites of all time. It's such an incredible track, practically about travel and being stuck in a transit lounge trauma type thing, and but it's more than that, obviously. With Jethro Tull, there's always more layers to it. But
I think I was never into sci-fi. I never particularly liked sci-fi.
What are you doing on our podcast?
It's Doctor Who. Doctor Who isn't sci-fi. I mean, give me history, give me horror, folklore, history, kind of that sort of stuff. Stuff on the edges, countryside stuff. That's what I go for. And for obvious reasons, the 70s and Jethro Tull, mid 70s are my period. Crest of a Knave. So they've gone through an electronic phase, and now they're going into a more world music phase.
let's just I think you've skipped over a couple really quick. I know we haven't got a lot of time, but let me just
Broadswords. I've skipped over Broadswords and the Beast, which I quite like.
Right, Broadswords and the Beast is one of those ones that a lot of Jethro Tull fans love, because it was hearkening, is that the word? Anyway, going back to the kind of Jethro Tull that they liked in the 70s, which was a bit of a trick. So by doing an amazing cover and making it look folky, it's still an electronic album. But I think the more you listen to it, it's electronic folk, and there isn't a lot of that around. And I think I have to think it's one of their best albums. It's so good, in fact, that my leather jacket when I was younger, I had it painted.
Wow. Well, that's incredibly blurry.
Is it?
Well, it's because you've got a blurred background on your Skype, I think. Or maybe it's just your camera's rubbish. No, it's your background's been blurred.
So imagine the album cover on a leather jacket. Basically, a friend of mine just painted it. Amazing. It's amazing. And it's never come off. That's like 40 years later. But it's quite influential, I think, for a lot of people at the time getting into it. And then Under Wraps, it's a massive experiment, which nobody seems to like, apart from me, it seems.
I mean, that's the second album I don't have. I've never really listened to it.
It's fully electronic. There's no drummer on there. I think it's an intensely clever and interesting and fun album. I played something to Simon once, who's into synth music, and he just laughed me out of the room. So plainly, they're trying to be something they're not, which is fine, and I forgive them.
I mean, this is the Jethro Tull thing. So their folk music isn't really folk, and if you're into folk, so what I quickly learned was that's not folk music. Then I listened to folk music, and I did get into folk music, but accessible stuff. But I still love the Jethro Tull folk music, but it's a pastiche. And I assume it's the same with world music, the same with electronic music. They're kind of he
doing
knows
their
what
own
he's
version.
doing.
Yeah.
Crest of a Knave, I really like. I think that's an underrated album.
And that's another leap in their popularity. So they were massive in the 70s in America and all of that. Then they became incredibly popular again because of the Grammy situation, which I don't know whether we've spoken about recording. We definitely spoke about it before we started recording, which is where they went head to head with Metallica. Metallica lost. I love Metallica as well, by the way, so that was a really interesting moment for me to go, what? And even Ian Anderson was confused why I was in the rock category, but it catapulted them up again into that popularity. And it is a cracking rock album, is what it is. It's a rock stroke folk album, I suppose. But then it was followed up with what I thought was quite a weak album with Rock Island.
Yeah, Rock Island and Catfish Rising are a little bit bland, I think. They don't have a lot of... I mean, Catfish Rising has a few catchy tunes, but it's a bit sort of... It feels like they've lost their direction slightly. I think Roots to Branches, I'm a fan of Roots. So Roots to Branches is one that I've become a fan of quite late in the day.
Yeah, so Catfish Rising is a return to the blues roots. You've got a few really good tracks on there. I remember going to see him live, and he was very ill that day. He had a real cold. He just didn't look good at all on stage. And apparently, a critic had really pummeled the album, and so he stood up there and called him a C word. Funny, but there's a big sharp intake of breath because family was taking their kids by this point. So he was in a bad mood about that because he said, you don't know how hard we work to try and create a piece of music. So I remember hearing it the first time and thinking, oh, that's all right. Then I thought, okay, he said that on stage, I'm going to go and listen to it, and I appreciate it a lot more now. But yeah, it can feel bland compared to the other albums of the past, which are much more intrinsically complex.
I mean, it's got rocks on it. So Catfish Rising does have Rocks on the Road, which I got it. That's the sort of Dire Straitsy kind of pastiche, which I did get into at the time. So he's still kind of capable of creating kind of catchy tunes.
Yeah.
I think we should move on to their latest album.
Okay, so they went through a quick world phase, didn't they?
They did.
World music phase, and I want to talk about Roots to Branches before we talk about the new album.
Okay, go on.
That's your album that you said
you've got 2 minutes to talk about Roots to Branches.
No,
I should. I think his voice is gone, but he's making music that suits his voice. So when he's playing live, obviously he's straining, but things like Stuck in the August Rain and other Harry's Bar and Valley, they're kind of recognizably catchy songs. I just think they're good, and it's got this kind of texture to it that isn't folk. It's not quite world. It's more sort of, it uses world music as a kind of a rhythm behind it, but it's still got that kind of observational stuff that he's looking at. But there's a bit of urbanness about it as well, which is kind of fresh for Jethro Tull.
Yeah. Some of it just makes me cringe a little bit, and I can't help it. And I think it's the same for the next 10, 20 years of Ian Anderson's output. Secret Language of Birds is definitely worth a listen. I think that's a great album, very acoustic and lovely. And there's a few others that are quite good, and they're quite backgroundy and quite ambient and things like that. That in a way, it's not really hitting you in the face like they used to. But with this new album that they've just released, now he's had a band for quite a while, touring with him for the Ian Anderson band. He's now decided to call them Jethro Tull because they've been with him for nearly 15 years. So fair enough. So I came in thinking, okay, Martin Barre's left, the main guitarist and friend of the band. What's it going to sound like? I played it all an hour before we started this podcast, and I've got to say, it's actually very good considering where we are in the period of Jethro Tull's history. It's got complexity, it's got texture, it's got it's quite full in places. The sound is better, although I'm not keen on the reverb on his voice, and I think the songs are going back to the Aqualung feel of looking at religion and not necessarily religion, but the world problems, global problems, which he puts into the album. Zealot Gene is one of his latest, and you can just tell by the title what he's talking about. So I would give it probably a score of about 7 out of 10, which is quite high for a modern Tull album for me, or Ian Anderson album. But I recommend listen to it if you've listened to other Tull. Definitely give it a go, and listen to it at least twice, and then come back and tell me that Mine Is the Mountain is the one that really makes me feel something.
I've listened to some of it quite quickly. I've listened to a few songs twice. My initial reaction is, yeah, I quite like the sound, and I think Shoshana Sleeping had this kind of really good sort of refrain going behind, which again is sort of this Middle Eastern world music refrain. I think that the overwhelming thing I can't quite get beyond is his voice, because I think his voice is so distinctive in his career, and it becomes like another instrument, and now it almost feels like he's in pain as he's singing. But that in time will become part of the texture of the album itself. So that what I feel about it is a kind of a nostalgia for how it used to be. But looking at it as an album in its own right, then I was finding some of the songs. I mean, the Zealot Gene, the title song, was catchy. It did have there was a catchiness to it.
I think his voice is. I think the whole thing's a lot more. It's a lot more relaxed, and it's a lot more. He's fallen into it. The band's fallen into it and gone, okay, we're Jethro Tull. Let's create a Jethro Tull album, which isn't so out there. It's going to make people go, oh, that's embarrassing. And it's not so far away from it. It's not going to impact. It's kind of hit a middle ground, and his voice, I think, sits okay actually, because he's not pushing himself, and that was the mistake he was making, was pushing his voice, and it doesn't work. But yeah, I'm glad this is out. So
yeah. So as a conclusion, I think if you've heard of Jethro Tull and you wanted to have an album that introduces Jethro Tull to you, I would probably go with Heavy Horses. I think that's got the right balance of folk and rock. And Lee would go for
Songs from the Wood, because that's got the right balance of rock and folk.
Rock and folk. But my opinion is pretty much Lee and I are pretty much simpatico. So that was Jethro Tull, and we shall conclude by saying I was Matt,
and I was Lee,
and we will speak again soon.
Ta-ra.